The room was suffocating, heavy with the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey. Golden chandeliers cast a dim glow over the crowd, illuminating a sea of well-dressed men seated in plush leather chairs, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Ellie Hayes stood on the elevated stage, her heart pounding so violently she thought they might hear it. She had known desperation before: hunger, loneliness, the sting of rejection from yet another foster home. But this was different. This was powerlessness. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the grand hall, polished and indifferent. Lot 17, an exquisite young woman, 19 years old, untouched, a rare find. Gentlemen. Ellie's stomach twisted at his words, her nails digging into her palms. She had been dragged into this nightmare against her will, a victim of a debt she never owed. A murmur of approval spread through the crowd as the bidding began. Numbers flew through the air, rising higher and higher as the men competed, their gazes hungry. 5 million. 7. 10. Ellie kept her chin up, refusing to let them see her fear. But her body trembled as she met the eyes of each bidder. They didn't see her as a person, only as a prize. Then, a new voice cut through the noise. Deeper, colder. 50 million. Silence fell. Even the auctioneer hesitated. Whispers rippled through the room. No one dared challenge the offer. Ellie's gaze shifted toward the man who had spoken. He sat in the shadows, effortlessly commanding the room. Roman Lancaster. She had heard his name before. One of the wealthiest and most ruthless businessmen in the country. He was the kind of man people feared. And now, he owned her. The auctioneer cleared his throat and slammed the gavel down. Sold. A shudder ran through Ellie as reality settled over her. This man had bought her with as little effort as he would a luxury car or a rare piece of art. But why? As the guards led her off the stage, she stole one last glance at Roman Lancaster. His expression was unreadable, his posture relaxed, as if this were just another business transaction. Ellie wasn't sure what was worse: the men who had openly ogled her, or the one who had claimed her without emotion. She swallowed hard. Whatever he wanted from her, she wasn't going to give in without a fight. The car ride was silent, the tension thick as Ellie sat stiffly in the back seat. Her hands clenched into fists on her lap. The city lights blurred past, giving way to the endless darkness of the highway. She had no idea where she was being taken, only that she was leaving behind one nightmare and stepping into another. When the car finally stopped, she was met with the sight of a sprawling mansion, its grand architecture bathed in the pale glow of moonlight. The estate was breathtaking. Marble columns, towering windows, perfectly manicured gardens. But there was something eerily lifeless about it. Like a museum exhibit, beautiful but untouched. The driver opened the door, but Ellie didn't move. She felt like a prisoner arriving at her cell. Out, a deep voice commanded. Roman Lancaster stood beside the car, his posture unreadable, his gaze sharp and assessing. He had barely spoken since the auction, and now, as she hesitated, something flickered in his eyes. Impatience, maybe, or amusement. Ellie lifted her chin and stepped out, determined not to let him see her fear. Inside, the mansion was just as cold as it looked. Everything was pristine, expensive, calculated. Not a single object felt personal. There were no family photos, no warmth, only vast, empty perfection. "This will be your room." Roman's voice was clipped, businesslike, as he led her to a suite larger than any place she'd ever lived. The king-size bed was draped in silk sheets, a crystal chandelier hung overhead, and the massive window overlooked the ocean. Ellie turned to him. "What do you expect from me?" Roman's expression remained impassive. "Nothing, for now." The words should have reassured her, but they didn't. There was an edge to them, something unreadable in his tone. Then, just as he turned to leave, he dropped a bombshell. "You're not to leave the estate." Ellie's heart pounded. She clenched her jaw. "He thinks he can cage me. He's wrong." The door clicked shut behind him, and she exhaled slowly, her mind already racing. She didn't know how or when, but one thing was certain: she would escape. Ellie sat rigidly on the velvet armchair in Roman's study, the weight of silence pressing down on her. The room, like the rest of the mansion, was meticulously designed. Dark mahogany shelves lined with books he probably never read, a marble fireplace that had likely never been used. It was a space meant to impress, not comfort. Roman stood by the window, his back to her, hands tucked into his pockets. His presence filled the room, commanding and distant, as if he were both here and somewhere else entirely. Then he spoke, his voice steady, devoid of emotion. "I need a wife." Ellie blinked, sure she had misheard him. "I'm sorry, what?" Roman turned, his gaze cold and assessing. "A wife. It's part of a business deal I'm negotiating. My associates expect stability, family values. A marriage serves their expectations." Ellie's stomach twisted. "This is what I've been reduced to. A business strategy." She forced a bitter smile. "And let me guess, you thought, why not pick up a wife at an auction? Convenient." A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe, crossed his face, but it was gone in an instant. "I don't expect you to be anything more than a name on paper," he continued. "You'll have your own space, your own life. But in public, we play our roles. When the contract is fulfilled, you'll be free." Ellie narrowed her eyes. "And what if I refuse?" Roman leaned against the desk, his expression unreadable. "Then you stay here, indefinitely. I own you, Ellie, but I'm giving you an option. This way, you have an end date." She gritted her teeth, anger rising like a flame. He spoke so casually, as if he weren't dictating the terms of her life. But he was right. She had no real choices. Still, she wouldn't make this easy for him. Lifting her chin, she met his gaze head-on. "Fine, I'll marry you." His brow lifted slightly, as if surprised by her quick agreement. "But let's be clear," she continued, voice unwavering. "I may wear your ring, but I will never belong to you." A slow, amused smirk curled Roman's lips. "We'll see." Ellie clenched her fists. "I swear on everything, I will find a way out of this." As he walked past her, Roman paused by the door. "The wedding is in 2 weeks. Try to look happy." When the door shut behind him, Ellie let out a shaky breath. 2 weeks. That's all the time I have to figure out how to escape. Ellie had sensed from the beginning that Roman Lancaster wasn't a man without enemies, but she hadn't expected them to be this close. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, gripping the ornate railing as she observed the 2 visitors below. The woman was striking, tall, with sleek dark hair and an elegance that spoke of old money. The man beside her had the same sharp bone structure as Roman, but there was something more calculating in his gaze, something unsettling. Sophia Mercer and Declan Lancaster. Ellie didn't know much about them yet, but the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Marriage? Sophia's laugh was sharp, almost mocking. "Roman, darling, you don't even believe in love. What are you playing at?" Roman stood near the fireplace, his expression unreadable. "It's not your concern." "Oh, but it is." Sophia stepped closer, her red lips curving into a knowing smile. "You and I were an arrangement. A perfect one. And now you've traded me for some auction girl?" Ellie clenched her fists. Auction girl. The way she said it, so dismissive, so certain that Ellie was nothing. Declan, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Tell me, brother," he mused, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Is this about the deal? Or has our ever-rational Roman finally gone soft?" His smirk was laced with malice. Roman's jaw tensed. "The deal will go through, and my marriage will ensure it. That's all you need to know." Sophia's gaze flickered toward Ellie, her eyes cold and assessing. "And what does she think about all this?" Ellie straightened, stepping down into view. If they wanted to play mind games, she wouldn't let them think she was weak. "I think," she said, voice steady, "that your obsession with Roman is exhausting." Sophia's lips twitched as if she found amusement in Ellie's defiance, but Declan's expression darkened, eyes narrowing slightly. Roman turned to Ellie, his gaze unreadable. "You should go." Ellie didn't argue. She knew this conversation wasn't over. Later that night, she wandered through the dimly lit library, her mind racing. Why do I feel like they weren't surprised by me? She ran her fingers along the spines of the books absent-mindedly until she found something tucked between them. A folded piece of paper. Her breath caught as she opened it. Her name. The auction date. A sum of money. This wasn't an accident. Someone wanted me there. The wedding was as cold as the man she had married. No flowers. No guests. No vows of love. Ellie stood in the center of Roman's vast estate, wearing an elegant yet impersonal white dress chosen by his assistant. The ceremony had been quick, a legal exchange, a mere formality. A judge read the required words, Roman signed the papers, and just like that, she was no longer Ellie Hayes. She was Eleanor Lancaster. Roman's ring felt heavier than it should on her finger, like a shackle disguised as jewelry. When it was over, he turned to her with that same unreadable expression. It's done. Ellie lifted her chin. Is this the part where you carry me across the threshold? His lips twitched, as if she had amused him for a brief second. But then, just as quickly, the moment passed. Come inside, he said, ignoring her sarcasm. She followed him into the mansion, where the staff had already cleared the minimal evidence of the ceremony. No champagne, no music, just silence. As they ascended the stairs, Ellie's heart pounded. She wasn't naive. She knew what happened on wedding nights. But Roman had made it clear this was a marriage of convenience. Still, a part of her tensed when he led her to her bedroom. This is yours, he said, standing by the door. Mine is down the hall. Ellie released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She wasn't sure if it was relief or something else. Roman hesitated for a second, lingering in the doorway. His usual detached mask cracked, just for a moment. The dim light cast shadows over his sharp features, making him look almost tired. You don't belong in this world, he murmured, almost to himself. Ellie frowned. Then why did you buy me? His gaze darkened. Good night, Eleanor. And just like that, he shut the door. Ellie stared at the closed door for a long time, her emotions a tangled mess. There had been something in his voice, a flicker of something real, something raw, but he had buried it just as quickly. She ran a hand down the smooth silk of her dress and glanced at her reflection in the mirror. The girl looking back at her was married to a stranger. And yet, somehow, she felt like she was the one who had disappeared. Ellie had spent the past few days trying to understand Roman Lancaster, but he was like a locked door, impenetrable, cold, impossible to read. Yet, the longer she was trapped in his world, the more she noticed the cracks in his armor. It was in the way he ran a hand through his hair when he thought no one was looking, the way his jaw clenched ever so slightly before making a difficult decision, the way his fingers tapped against the armrest when he was lost in thought. He wasn't as unaffected as he wanted people to believe. Tonight, they sat across from each other at the long dining table, a meal laid out between them. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Ellie set her fork down with a sharp clink. Do you even eat? Or is your diet strictly built on power and intimidation? Roman's gaze lifted, meeting hers with a flicker of something. Surprise? Amusement? You have quite a mouth on you, he mused, swirling the whiskey in his glass. She tilted her head. You paid a fortune for me. Didn't you read the fine print? His lips twitched, as if fighting the urge to smile. But then, just as quickly, the amusement faded. His guard snapped back into place. Ellie leaned forward, studying him. Why do you do that? He arched a brow. Do what? Act like you don't feel anything. Like nothing touches you. Roman's grip on his glass tightened. A beat of silence passed, the air thick with unspoken words. Then, he set his drink down and stood. You assume too much, Eleanor. She hated when he called her that. It was distant, formal. And yet, for the first time, he hesitated before walking away. Ellie watched him go, feeling an odd sense of victory. She had gotten under his skin, just a little. That night, as she lay curled up in bed, the moonlight casting faint shadows on the walls, she had the strangest feeling, like someone was watching her. She shifted slightly, her breathing steady but alert. Outside her door, in the dimly lit hallway, Roman stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the closed door. He should leave. He should forget about the girl who was unraveling him piece by piece. But he didn't move, because for the first time in years, something about another person truly unsettled him. Ellie's heart pounded as she ran through the cold night air, her bare feet sinking into the damp earth. The mansion loomed behind her, its distant lights a cruel reminder of the prison she was trying to escape. She had waited for the perfect moment. When the staff changed shifts, when the security cameras faced the other direction. It had taken days to gather the courage, but she finally had a chance. The road was just ahead. Freedom was within reach. Then, suddenly, arms wrapped around her from behind. She thrashed, kicked, tried to scream, but a strong grip pinned her in place. "Easy there, Mrs. Lancaster," the guard muttered, his tone more amused than concerned. "Where do you think you're going?" Her stomach twisted. No, 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 no. The guard dragged her back toward the house, her fight useless against his strength. By the time they reached the mansion's entrance, the door was already open. Roman stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, his dark eyes locked onto hers. The silence was worse than yelling. The guard let go of her, stepping back, caught her near the east gate. Roman didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the guard. He only stared at Ellie, and that was somehow more terrifying than if he had shouted. "Leave us," he ordered, voice dangerously low. The guard hesitated for a second before nodding and disappearing down the hallway. Ellie braced herself for whatever Roman would say, but the silence stretched. His hands were in his pockets, his face calm, too calm. "You actually thought you'd get away?" His voice wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. It was something worse, disappointed. Ellie lifted her chin, refusing to look away. "I had to try." Roman exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. For the first time, she noticed something flicker in his expression, tension, frustration, something deeper she couldn't name. "Do you have any idea what could have happened to you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, rougher. Ellie blinked. "Excuse me?" His jaw clenched, but his next words weren't filled with anger. They were edged with something else, something that made her breath hitch. "If someone else had found you first?" It hit her then. He wasn't just furious. He had been scared. Ellie stepped back, caught off guard. "He doesn't want me here, but he doesn't want me gone either." She had thought Roman Lancaster was indifferent, cold, untouchable. But tonight, for the first time, she saw something else in him. And she didn't know what was more dangerous, the fact that she had failed to escape, or the realization that he actually cared. Ellie didn't trust Sophia Mercer. The woman carried herself with effortless grace, exuding the kind of confidence that only came from privilege and years of knowing she was untouchable. But her words? They were sharp, calculated, meant to cut. "Has he told you how this ends?" Sophia asked, swirling the wine in her glass as she lounged on the chaise in the sitting room. Ellie kept her posture rigid, refusing to let Sophia see how her presence affected her. "What are you talking about?" Sophia sighed dramatically, setting her glass down. "Darling, Roman collects things, rare art, priceless cars, limited edition watches. And now you." Her gaze flickered over Ellie, assessing, unimpressed. "But things get old. They lose value. And when that happens, they're discarded." Ellie swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She refused to let Sophia's words plant doubt in her mind. But the seed was already there, burrowing into the quiet insecurities she hadn't dared to voice. Was she just another acquisition to Roman? A fleeting interest? She didn't wait to process the answer. Ellie found Roman in his study, where he always was, alone, detached, his mind buried in something other than her. "I need to know something," she said, stepping inside. Roman looked up from his desk, brows furrowing. "You should knock." "Why? Would it make a difference?" She folded her arms. "Or am I just another thing you own?" The tension in the room shifted instantly. Roman slowly set his pen down, his expression unreadable. "Who put that idea in your head?" "It doesn't matter," she shot back. "I just want the truth." He stood, walking around the desk, his presence suffocating. "You want the truth?" His voice was quieter now, dangerously calm. "Fine. You are here because of a contract, because I needed something, and you happen to be the solution." Ellie's stomach twisted. "So that's it? A business transaction?" Roman stepped closer, close enough that she could see the tightness in his jaw, the the flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "That's what you wanted to hear, isn't it?" Ellie's breath hitched. She hated him in that moment, hated how he could say things that cut her, but never reveal what was happening beneath his carefully built walls. She turned to leave, but suddenly, Roman grabbed her wrist, pulling her back, and then, before she could process it, his lips were on hers. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't planned. It was raw, impulsive, laced with something he hadn't meant to reveal. Then, just as quickly, he pulled away. His breathing was unsteady, his eyes dark with something like regret. "Go," he muttered, his voice rough. Ellie stared at him, her heart hammering, and then she did. The storm came without warning. Ellie stood by the window of the small beach house, watching as the rain pounded against the glass, the wind howling like a restless spirit. The ocean, usually calm, was now a churning, chaotic force, matching the storm brewing inside her. She hadn't expected to end up here, alone with Roman, stranded in his secluded coastal retreat after the storm made it impossible to return to the city. Roman sat on the couch, staring into the dim fire he had lit earlier, his usual unreadable expression in place. But tonight, there was something different about him, something unguarded. Ellie exhaled, turning to face him. "Do you ever actually enjoy any of this?" His gaze lifted. "Any of what?" "This," she gestured around, frustration laced in her voice. "The wealth, the power, the control over everything. Does any of it make you happy?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Happiness is a fleeting illusion." Ellie frowned. "That's not an answer." Roman leaned back, watching her carefully. Then, after a long pause, he said something she never expected. "My father used to bring me here." His voice was quieter now, almost distant. "When I was young, before everything became what it is." Ellie stilled. Roman never talked about his past. She sat across from him, hesitating before asking, "What happened?" His fingers traced the rim of his glass. "He wasn't a good man. He thought strength meant control. That emotions made you weak." A humorless smirk flickered on his lips. "So, I learned to stop feeling." Ellie's chest tightened. She had seen glimpses of something broken inside him before, but hearing it confirmed felt different. She stepped closer. "That's not true," she murmured. "You feel more than you let on." Roman looked at her then, really looked at her. The firelight cast soft shadows across his face, making him seem almost vulnerable, almost human. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the air between them thick with something unspoken. Then, the power flickered out, plunging the house into darkness. Ellie let out a breath. "Great," Roman sighed. "There's a spare blanket in the bedroom." Ellie followed him, shivering as the cold seeped in. She hesitated before slipping under the blanket beside him. She should have kept her distance, but somehow, her body moved closer, seeking warmth. Roman didn't stop her, and when he finally exhaled, his body relaxing against hers, she realized, maybe, just maybe, she was breaking through. By morning, the storm had passed, but so had whatever moment they had shared. Because when Ellie woke up, the warmth was gone. And Roman? He was already up, dressed, and back behind his carefully constructed walls. Declan Lancaster had always known his brother was cold, ruthless, unshakable, but something had changed. Roman was slipping, hesitating in ways he never had before. And Declan knew exactly why. Ellie. He had watched the way Roman looked at her when he thought no one was paying attention. It was subtle, his gaze lingering too long, his grip tightening ever so slightly when someone else got too close. Roman Lancaster was falling, and that was unacceptable. Declan leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his fingers against his whiskey glass. If Roman was growing attached, then it was time to remind him that love was nothing but a liability. It was time to remove Ellie from the equation. Ellie didn't see it coming. One moment, she was walking through the halls of the mansion, trying to shake off the lingering warmth of the night before. The next, she was standing in Roman's study, his cold gaze cutting into her like a blade. "What's wrong?" she asked, her stomach twisting at the way he was looking at her. Roman held up a single photograph. "Explain this." Ellie frowned, stepping closer. The image was grainy, but clear enough. Her, standing in the garden, speaking to a man she didn't recognize. His hand was on her arm, the angle making it seem more intimate than it had been. She scoffed. This isn't what it looks like. Roman's jaw clenched. Then tell me what it is. Ellie folded her arms. It's a setup, obviously. You know that. His silence was worse than yelling. Something inside Ellie cracked. You don't actually believe this, do you? Roman's fingers tightened around the photograph. Why wouldn't I? Ellie took a shaky breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Because I haven't done anything wrong. Because She stopped herself before saying something she couldn't take back. Roman's expression didn't waver. I warned you not to play games with me, Ellie. She stared at him, disbelief crashing over her. After everything, after the storm, after the small moments where she thought she was beginning to see the real him, this was what it took for him to shut down again? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You really think I would betray you? His eyes darkened. I think I don't trust anyone. Something inside her broke. She had been naive to think she was getting through to him. She swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice hollow when she spoke again. Then I guess we understand each other perfectly. Roman didn't stop her when she turned and walked away. And Ellie didn't look back. Ellie didn't cry. She wanted to, but there was nothing left inside her to break. She had spent the past few weeks trying to understand Roman, trying to find something real between them, trying to believe that, maybe, despite everything, he wasn't as cold as he pretended to be. But now, she saw the truth. He would never trust her. She sat in her room, staring at the engagement ring on her finger, the symbol of the twisted arrangement that had brought her here. It wasn't real. None of it was. A quiet knock at the door startled her. Ellie turned to see Declan leaning against the frame, his usual smirk in place, though something in his eyes was too smooth, too calculated. You look like a ghost, he mused. She exhaled sharply. If you came to gloat, don't waste your time. Declan chuckled, stepping inside. I came to help you. Ellie arched a brow. Why would you help me? He shrugged. Let's just say Roman and I have different opinions on certain things. I don't think he deserves your loyalty. Ellie stiffened, but Declan pressed on. Do you really think he'll ever see you as anything other than a liability? He gave her a pointed look. He's done with you, Ellie. He just doesn't know how to say it. Her heart clenched, but she kept her face neutral. And you expect me to believe you? Believe whatever you want, he said smoothly. But if you stay, you'll rot in this mansion, waiting for a man who will never love you. If you leave now, you might still have a chance at freedom. The word freedom burned through her like fire. It was what she had wanted from the beginning, what she had fought for. Declan slid a small envelope onto the table beside her. There's a car waiting at the back entrance. No security. No one will stop you. Think about it. And with that, he walked away, leaving her alone with the choice. Ellie stared at the envelope, at the keys inside, at the single opportunity she had to escape. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she stood. She didn't take anything with her. No notes, no goodbyes. She didn't owe Roman anything. Slipping out into the cold night air, she kept her footsteps light, her heart pounding with every step away from the mansion. No alarms. No voices calling her back. By the time the car disappeared into the darkness, Ellie didn't look back. She was gone. Roman Lancaster had never been a man who feared loss. He had built his empire on control, on knowing that everything and everyone around him could be manipulated, bargained for, replaced. But now, standing in the empty halls of his mansion, he felt something foreign clawing at his chest. Regret. Ellie was gone. It had been days, and he had turned the city upside down trying to find her. No sightings, no messages, no leads. She had vanished as if she had never existed. And the worst part? He had let her go. He clenched his fists, pacing in his study, unable to focus on anything except the way she had looked at him before she left, her eyes empty, defeated. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. One of the house staff entered hesitantly, holding a small envelope. Sir, we found this in Mrs. Lancaster's room. Roman snatched it from the man's hand before he could finish speaking. His fingers tightened around the paper as he unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, precise, but he could see the hesitation in some of the words, as if she had debated whether to write them at all. Roman, I won't waste time explaining why I left. You won't believe me anyway, but there's something I need you to know. Something I should have told you before I walked away. I loved you, and I hate myself for it. Ellie. Roman's breath caught. He read the words again, then again. His grip on the paper tightened, his jaw locking as the weight of her confession settled over him. She had loved him. He felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. He had spent so long convincing himself that Ellie was just another obligation, another deal he had made. But somewhere along the way, she had become something more, and he had lost her. A bitter chuckle escaped him. She thinks I didn't believe her? The irony was suffocating. For the first time in years, Roman Lancaster felt truly powerless. He wasn't going to let this end like this. She had run from him, believing there was nothing worth staying for. Now, he had to prove her wrong. Roman Lancaster had built his empire on knowing the game before it was played. So how had he been so blind? Declan, Sophia, two people he should have never trusted, yet he had let them manipulate him like a fool. Ellie was gone because of them, because he had believed the worst of her when he should have known better. Now, standing in his brother's office, his patience was gone. You set me up. Roman's voice was quiet, but it held the weight of a storm about to break. Declan leaned back in his leather chair, unfazed. Define, set up. Roman slammed the crumpled photograph onto the desk, the one Declan had used to frame Ellie. How long were you planning this? Declan smirked, swirling his drink. You make it sound so dramatic. I only gave you a little push in the right direction. Roman's hands curled into fists. You manipulated me into driving her away. Declan sighed as if Roman was the one being unreasonable. Please, you were never going to keep her. I just sped up the inevitable. Roman's breath came slow and measured, but inside, he was ready to tear the room apart. Where is she? Declan's smirk widened. Oh, now you care? Roman didn't hesitate. In one swift move, he grabbed Declan by the collar and slammed him against the desk. The glass of whiskey shattered to the floor. Declan's smirk faltered, but only slightly. Touchy, touchy. Roman leaned in, his voice a low growl. Where is she? Declan chuckled, shaking his head. Even if I knew, do you think I'd tell you? His eyes gleamed with something cruel. You always think you can fix things, Roman. But this time, he smiled. You might already be too late. Roman's stomach clenched. He wanted to believe Declan was bluffing, that Ellie was still out there, safe. But something in his brother's voice made his blood turn cold. He let go, shoving Declan back into his chair. I swear, if anything happens to her. Declan straightened his shirt, unfazed. What? You'll finally start acting like a brother? He scoffed. Save the theatrics. You had your chance to keep her. He leaned forward, eyes dark with satisfaction. And you let her go. Roman's jaw tightened. Not anymore. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his mind already racing. Ellie was out there, and no matter what it took, he was going to find her. Roman stood outside the small bookstore, his breath visible in the cold evening air. It had taken him weeks to find her. Countless dead ends, sleepless nights, and a growing fear that Declan had been right, that he was too late. But then, he had seen her. Through the glass window, Ellie sat behind the counter, flipping through a book, completely unaware that the world outside was closing in on her. She looked different, softer. Her hair was loosely tied back, and she wore a cozy sweater that drowned her small frame. She looked at peace, and it made Roman's stomach twist, because he was about to destroy that peace. Taking a breath, he stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed. Ellie glanced up and froze. For a long, excruciating second, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, she stood. What are you doing here? Roman's throat was dry. I came for you. Ellie's eyes darkened. She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. No, you don't get to do this. Ellie, you don't get to show up here after everything. After what you said. After what you made me feel. Her voice trembled, but there was steel behind it. You don't get to pretend to care now. Roman stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I was wrong. She let out a humorless laugh. Which part? Accusing me of betraying you? Letting me walk away without stopping me? Roman exhaled, his gaze locked onto hers. All of it. Ellie swallowed, her hands shaking at her sides. She looked away, as if gathering the strength to push him out of her life for good. And then, almost as an afterthought, she whispered, "It doesn't matter anymore." Roman's chest tightened. Why? She hesitated, a second too long. And then, he knew. His gaze dropped to the way her arms instinctively folded over her stomach. His heart pounded. Ellie. She took a step back, shaking her head. Don't. Roman's jaw tightened. Are you?
Yes.
Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it struck like a gunshot. I'm pregnant. Silence stretched between them. Ellie's eyes shone with unshed tears, but her chin lifted in quiet defiance. And you don't get to come here and pretend you care. Not now. Roman stared at her, his mind racing, his heart a battlefield of emotions he had never let himself feel. He had come here to bring her back, but now he had even more to fight for. And he wasn't leaving without her. Declan Lancaster had always known how to exploit a weakness, and now Roman had one. Ellie. It had been almost too easy to find out about her pregnancy. People talked, and money had a way of making them talk faster. Declan leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk as he read through the legal document in front of him. All he needed was Ellie's signature. One signature, and Roman's empire would be his. But Ellie wouldn't sign willingly, which meant he had to make her. Ellie walked down the quiet alley behind the bookstore, pulling her coat tighter against the evening chill. She hated that Roman had found her. Hated that, despite everything, seeing him again had hurt just as much as leaving had. But it didn't change anything. She wouldn't go back. Her thoughts were so loud that she almost didn't hear the footsteps behind her. Almost. The moment she turned, a hand clamped over her mouth. Panic surged through her veins. She struggled, kicking, thrashing, but her captor was stronger, dragging her into a waiting car before she could scream. The door slammed shut. Ellie's heart pounded as she twisted to face her captor, Declan. He smiled, his gaze flickering to her stomach before meeting her eyes. Well, well, he murmured. You really have been busy. Ellie's stomach twisted with fear, but she forced herself to meet his gaze head-on. What do you want? Declan leaned back, looking far too relaxed for a man who had just kidnapped her. Just a small favor. He pulled a stack of papers from his coat. You're going to sign these. Ellie's breath caught as she scanned the document. The language was complex, but the intent was clear. If she signed, she would be forfeiting everything in Roman's name, handing over his shares, his company, his entire empire. Her pulse pounded. Why would I do that? Declan tilted his head, a slow, sinister smile spreading across his face. Because if you don't, I can't guarantee your safety. Or the baby's. Ellie's blood ran cold. She had always known Declan was ruthless, but this was something else. He leaned in slightly. So what will it be, Ellie? Your pride? Or your child? Her heart pounded in her chest. She had no way to escape. No one knew where she was. And Declan held all the power. For the first time since she had been taken, true fear settled into her bones. And then, just as she opened her mouth to respond, the car sped off into the night. Ellie was gone. Again. Roman's phone buzzed. He almost didn't check it. His mind was already consumed with thoughts of Ellie, the anger burning in his veins after she had disappeared again. But something about the unknown number made his stomach twist. When he opened the message, his blood ran cold. A video? Ellie. She was tied to a chair, her wrists bound, her face pale with fear. The dim light of an abandoned warehouse flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across her body. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Then, a voice spoke from off-screen. You have a choice, brother. Declan. Roman's fingers curled around the phone, so tightly it nearly cracked. Ellie flinched at whatever was said next. Then, as if she could see him through the screen, she whispered, Don't come. The video cut out. Roman exhaled slowly, forcing his mind to stay clear, his rage under control. He knew exactly what this was, a trap. Declan wanted him desperate, reckless. But there was no choice. Ellie was his. And no one was going to take her from him. The warehouse was exactly what Roman expected, dark, damp, and filled with the stench of rust and decay. The kind of place where people disappeared. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing against the concrete floor. Then he saw her. Ellie was slumped in the chair, her hands still tied, her breathing uneven. But when she heard him, her head snapped up. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, nothing else existed. She shook her head, panic flashing across her face. "Roman, don't." A slow clap interrupted her. Declan stepped out of the shadows, smug as ever. Right on time. Roman's entire body tensed. "Let her go." Declan smirked. "And here I thought you didn't care about her." He tilted his head. "But I suppose love makes fools of us all, doesn't it?" Roman took a step forward. "You want my empire? Take it. Just let her go." Declan chuckled. "Oh, brother, this was never about your empire." He gestured toward Ellie. "She made you weak. And weakness? It's unacceptable." Roman's vision blurred with rage, but he kept his voice steady. "If you touch her," Declan sighed, shaking his head. "You always think you're in control, Roman. But tonight," his smirk widened, "you lose." Then, a gunshot rang out. Ellie screamed. Roman staggered back. For a terrifying second, pain exploded in his side, and the world tilted. But then, he saw Declan collapse to the ground, a look of shock on his face. Ellie was still screaming his name, trying to free herself, but Roman could barely move. The warehouse spun around him. The last thing he heard before darkness took over. Her voice, raw with fear. "Roman, stay with me." Pain ripped through Roman's side, but he forced himself to stay upright. Blood seeped through his shirt, hot and sticky, but he didn't have time to think about it. Ellie was still tied to the chair, struggling against the ropes, her eyes wide with terror. Declan lay on the cold warehouse floor, his expression frozen in shock. His body twitched, his own gun slipping from his grasp as blood pooled beneath him. For a second, silence hung in the air. Then, Roman moved. He ignored the burning pain in his body and stumbled forward, reaching Ellie. His hands were slick with blood. His or Declan's, he wasn't sure. But he didn't stop. He yanked at the ropes, his vision blurring at the edges. Ellie sobbed as her arms came free, and the moment she could move, she threw herself at him. "Roman! Oh my God!" Her hands pressed against his wound, desperate to stop the bleeding. Roman gritted his teeth. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," she cried, her fingers trembling. "You're—" A groan from the ground made them both freeze. "Declan." Roman turned his head, his body screaming in protest. His brother was still alive, barely, struggling to lift his gun with shaking hands. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, now flickered with something else. Fear. Roman reached for the fallen gun near his own feet, his fingers wrapping around the grip. Declan let out a weak chuckle. "What now, Roman?" His voice was ragged. "Going to finish the job?" Roman didn't blink. He lifted the gun, then threw it aside. "You're not worth it," he muttered. Sirens wailed in the distance. Ellie sucked in a breath. "Police." Declan coughed, his strength failing. You think this is over?" He let out a rasping laugh. "I wasn't the only one who wanted you ruined." Roman didn't care. Because right now, the only thing that mattered was Ellie. His legs gave out. He barely felt himself hit the ground before Ellie was there, cradling him in her arms, pressing her hands harder against his wound. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no. Stay with me." Roman tried to focus on her face. His eyelids were heavy, his body numb. But Ellie, she was warm, her touch desperate, her tears falling onto his skin. She was saying something, but his ears were ringing. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Ellie's face, filled with terror, love, and something else. Something that made him want to fight to stay. Then, everything went black. The first thing Roman registered was warmth, not the suffocating heat of pain or the dull throb of his healing wound, but something softer, familiar. Ellie. His eyelids felt impossibly heavy, but when he finally managed to open them, the sight of her made the struggle worth it. She sat beside his bed, curled into the chair, her head resting on the edge of the mattress. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, her usually neat hair falling loosely over her face. She looked exhausted, and yet, as if sensing his gaze, she stirred, blinking blearily before her eyes landed on him. The moment she realized he was awake, her breath hitched. "Roman," she whispered. He tried to smirk. "You look terrible." A choked laugh left her lips, but her hands were already on him. Light, careful, checking for reassurance that he was real, that he was still here. "You almost died," she muttered, glaring at him through watery eyes. "But I didn't," he rasped, swallowing against the dryness in his throat. "I told you I'm too stubborn for that." Ellie let out a shaky breath, squeezing his hand. "You scared me." Roman studied her, his usual mask nowhere to be found. He had spent so much of his life pushing people away, convincing himself that love was just another weakness. But Ellie, she was different. She had been thrown into his world, into his life, against her will. She should have run from him the first chance she got. And yet, she was still here. He exhaled slowly. "Ellie." Something in his voice must have warned her, because she straightened, her hands tightening around his. "I love you," he said, the words falling effortlessly from his lips. No hesitation, no fear, just the truth. Ellie sucked in a breath. Roman had never said those words to anyone. He hadn't even let himself think them before. But now, looking into her teary eyes, he knew there had never been another outcome. It had always been her. Tears slipped down Ellie's cheeks, but she smiled, a real, breathtaking smile. "I love you too," she whispered. A weight lifted from his chest, replaced by something lighter, warmer. For the first time in his life, Roman Lancaster felt free. Ellie leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "I'm not going anywhere," she murmured against his skin. Roman closed his eyes, letting her words settle deep into his bones. She was his, and this time, he wouldn't let her go. The storm had finally passed. Roman stood by the window of their new home, watching the waves roll against the shore. The ocean had always been a reminder of chaos, unpredictable, dangerous. But today, it was calm. For the first time in his life, so was he. Declan was gone. His arrest had been swift and merciless. Roman hadn't even needed to lift a finger. The evidence spoke for itself. The moment the authorities had gotten involved, Declan's empire crumbled like a house of cards. Sophia, ever the survivor, had vanished before anyone could implicate her. He wasn't surprised. She had always been a woman who valued self-preservation over loyalty. But none of that mattered now, because Roman was done with all of it. The empire he had built, the power he had held so tightly for years, it no longer defined him. He had something more important now. He turned to look at Ellie, who was curled up on the couch, a book resting on her lap. The warm glow of the fireplace bathed her in soft light, making her look almost unreal. She must have sensed his gaze because she glanced up, her lips curving into a gentle smile. "You're staring," she teased. Roman smirked, stepping closer. "Get used to it," she laughed, but then her breath hitched. Her hand flew to her stomach, eyes wide with surprise. Roman's heart stopped. "Ellie," she swallowed, her fingers pressing against the small curve of her belly. "I think," she gasped softly, "I think the baby just kicked." Everything inside him went still. Roman had faced men twice his size, built an empire from the ground up, survived a bullet wound. Yet nothing had ever prepared him for this. He knelt beside her, placing a hesitant hand over hers. And then, he felt it. A tiny, unmistakable movement beneath his palm. Roman exhaled sharply, his throat tightening. He had never considered himself an emotional man. But in that moment, something inside him shattered. This wasn't just a business deal. This wasn't just an obligation. This was his family. Ellie studied his face, her expression soft. "You okay?" Roman swallowed. nodding once. Yeah. His voice was rough, his usual control slipping. Ellie reached up, cupping his face with her hand. You're going to be a great father, Roman. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of her touch anchor him. For so long, he had been afraid of love, of what it could do to him, of how it could make him weak. But now, he realized the truth. Love didn't weaken him. It made him stronger. And he would spend the rest of his life proving it to them. The second time Ellie walked down the aisle, it wasn't in a grand ballroom or a cold, lifeless ceremony. It was on the beach, barefoot in the soft sand, the sun setting behind her, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The salty breeze played with the edges of her dress, and the rhythmic sound of the waves filled the air like a melody. But none of that mattered, because this time, she was walking toward love. Roman stood at the altar, waiting for her. He wasn't the same man she had married the first time. The Roman Lancaster of months ago had been controlled, closed off, unwilling to let anyone in. But the man standing before her now, his eyes held nothing but love. As she reached him, he took her hands, his grip firm and grounding. You sure you want to do this? He teased, a smirk playing at his lips. You're stuck with me this time. Ellie laughed, squeezing his hands. I think I can handle that. The ceremony was simple, intimate, just them and the people who truly mattered. No business deals, no contracts, no obligations. Just love. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, Roman wasted no time. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with the kind of devotion that left no doubt. This was real. Cheers erupted around them. Ellie barely noticed, because in that moment, all she could feel was him. Later that night, after the laughter had faded and their guests had gone, Roman led Ellie down the wooden path that wound through the dunes, his hand firm around hers. I have something for you, he murmured. Ellie raised a brow. Another wedding gift? You've already given me everything. Roman smirked. Not everything. They reached a small, secluded house nestled between the dunes, the soft glow of lanterns illuminating the porch. Ellie's breath hitched. Roman. He watched her, his expression soft. It's ours. She turned to him, eyes wide. You bought this? I built it, he corrected. Every part of it. I wanted a home for us, one that wasn't tied to my past. Ellie swallowed the lump in her throat, overwhelmed. She stepped forward, resting a hand against the wooden door. Home. Not a mansion, not a prison, not a gilded cage. A real home. She turned back to Roman, emotion thick in her voice. I love you. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close. Good, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Because I'm never letting you go. The house looked different now, not just because of the renovations, the fresh coat of paint, the sturdy new deck, the warm glow of lights spilling from the windows, but because of what it represented. A home. Their home. Ellie stood on the porch, her fingers tracing the polished wood of the railing, her heart full in a way she never could have imagined months ago. She felt safe. Roman stepped up beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. Do you approve? He murmured against her temple. She turned to him, a soft smile on her lips. It's perfect. They had come so far. From the cold halls of his mansion, from the tension, the distance, the unspoken fears that had once kept them apart. Now, there was only them. Roman took her hand, leading her inside. The space was warm, filled with rich wooden tones and soft, inviting furniture. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the waves, the rhythm of the ocean a steady reminder of the life they had built from the wreckage of their past. Ellie ran her fingers over the edge of the kitchen counter. I still can't believe you designed this place yourself. Roman smirked. I told you, I wanted something new, something that wasn't built on old ghosts. She met his gaze. And is it? His expression softened. It is now. They wandered through the house, past the living room with the oversized couch she had insisted on, past the fireplace that Roman swore he wouldn't use but that she knew he secretly loved. Then, finally, into their bedroom. It was simpler than the one she had once had in his estate. No expensive chandeliers, no grand marble floors, just a wide, inviting bed, soft linen sheets, and the salty breeze drifting through the open window. Ellie sat on the edge of the mattress, Roman kneeling in front of her. His hands found her hips, steady and grounding. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Just thinking. About." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Everything." Roman exhaled, his thumb tracing small circles against her waist. "If I could go back," he paused, as if debating his next words. "I'd do things differently." Ellie smiled gently, placing her hand over his. "I wouldn't." He raised a brow. She laced her fingers with his, squeezing softly. "Everything led us here. And here." She glanced around their home, their sanctuary. "This is exactly where I want to be." Roman studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then, slowly, he reached out, resting his palm against her stomach. A soft flutter moved beneath his touch. His breath caught. Ellie swallowed, watching his face carefully. "Did you feel that?" Roman didn't answer immediately. He just held his hand there, completely still, as if afraid to break the moment. Then, he looked up, his voice quiet but firm. "I swear to you," he murmured, his fingers tightening slightly over her stomach, "I will never let you suffer again." Ellie's heart swelled, because this time, she believed him. The world had never felt this small. Roman Lancaster had stood in the tallest buildings, controlled rooms full of powerful men, held the fate of multimillion-dollar deals in the palm of his hand. And yet, nothing compared to the weight of what he held now. A tiny, fragile body wrapped in a soft blanket, warm and perfect, resting in his arms. His son. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft murmurs of nurses outside and the steady beeping of machines monitoring Ellie's vitals. She was asleep, her face peaceful despite the exhaustion that lined it, her body still recovering from hours of labor. Roman barely breathed as he looked down at the child in his arms. His child. His son's tiny fingers curled slightly, resting against his chest as if he belonged there. Roman swallowed hard. This wasn't supposed to be him. He had spent his whole life believing that love, family, only led to weakness. That his father had been right when he said that caring too much would one day destroy him. But holding his son now, watching Ellie rest after giving him something he never thought he'd have, this wasn't weakness. This was everything. A soft stir from the bed caught his attention. Ellie blinked, her lashes fluttering as she slowly opened her eyes. The moment she saw them, her lips parted in quiet wonder. "You're holding him." Roman exhaled a shaky breath, his throat thick. "Yeah." She smiled, soft, radiant, entirely his. "Come here," she whispered. Carefully, as if afraid the moment might shatter, Roman stepped closer, sitting beside her on the hospital bed. Ellie reached out, her fingers brushing over their son's tiny head before she looked at Roman again. "You okay?" she asked gently. Roman let out a quiet chuckle. "I have no idea what I'm doing." Ellie leaned her head against his shoulder. "Neither do I." They sat in silence, absorbing the gravity of what had just happened, what they had created, what they had become. A family. Roman turned his head slightly, pressing a kiss to Ellie's temple, his lips lingering there. "Thank you." Ellie frowned slightly, tilting her head to meet his gaze. "For what?" His throat tightened. He looked down at his son, at the woman who had changed everything for him, and knew exactly what he had to say. "For saving me." Ellie inhaled sharply, her fingers gripping his as emotion flickered through her eyes. Roman's gaze didn't waver. "I was broken before you. I just didn't know it." A tear slipped down Ellie's cheek, but her smile never faltered. She reached up, cupping his face, her thumb brushing against his jaw. "You weren't broken," she whispered. "You were just waiting for something to make you whole." Roman closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then, gently, he placed a kiss on their son's forehead, sealing a silent promise. He would be different. He would be better. For them. Ellie sighed contentedly, resting her head against him once more. He's going to be so loved. Roman tightened his grip around them both, his heart full in a way he never imagined possible. He already is. And for the first time in his life, Roman Lancaster wasn't afraid of love anymore. Because now, He had everything, and it had always been her. The morning sunlight spilled through the sheer curtains, casting a golden glow over the soft linen sheets. The sound of waves crashing against the shore hummed through the open windows, filling the house with a peaceful rhythm, one that had become the heartbeat of their new life. Ellie stood in the doorway of the bedroom, her gaze locked on the scene before her. Roman sat on the edge of their bed, cradling their newborn son in his arms. His usual sharp, commanding presence had softened, replaced by something Ellie had rarely seen before. Pure, unguarded love. The baby's tiny hand wrapped around one of Roman's fingers, his grip small but firm. Roman sat perfectly still, watching him with quiet awe, as if afraid to break the moment. Ellie smiled, stepping forward. "You're staring." Roman glanced up at her, a rare softness in his expression. "He's incredible." Ellie leaned down, brushing a kiss against the top of Roman's head before gently running a hand over their son's tiny back. "He has your eyes." Roman chuckled, shaking his head. "Poor kid." Ellie rolled her eyes, but there was warmth in her voice. "I think he's lucky." Silence settled between them, but it was a comfortable one. The kind that came when words weren't necessary. Roman reached out, pulling Ellie onto the bed beside him, careful not to disturb the baby resting in his arms. She curled into his side, her head resting against his shoulder, as they both gazed at their son. "I used to think this wasn't for me," Roman admitted, his voice quiet. "Love. Family. I thought it would make me weak." Ellie lifted her head slightly, watching him. His eyes stayed on their son, but his grip on her tightened slightly. "But you proved me wrong." He finally met her gaze, and there was no hesitation this time. "You saved me, Ellie." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she smiled. "You saved yourself, Roman. I just refused to let you give up before you figured it out." He smirked, shaking his head. "Always stubborn." She grinned. "You love that about me." Roman exhaled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I love everything about you." Ellie sighed, letting the moment settle deep into her heart. For so long, she had fought against the idea of belonging to someone, of trusting, of letting herself believe in a love that wasn't fleeting. But here, in Roman's arms, with their child between them, she knew she was home. And this time, neither of them would ever be alone again, because it had always been them. Always.